If you have ever looked into what the Cultural Revolution was, you have most likely heard that it was an awful event that had fanatical Red Guards beating up people, destroying buildings, and creating chaos. While these aspects of the Cultural Revolution should not be overlooked and should be criticized, what this narrative misses out is the fact that the vast majority of the Chinese population lived in rural areas, and this urban fanaticism, coming from the urban youth, only represented a minority of what the Cultural Revolution was about. Dongping Han, a Chinese scholar who himself was born and raised on a collective farm in China, wrote about how life was before and during the Cultural Revolution for ordinary peasants in his book The Unknown Cultural Revolution. In this video, we will explore what this book had to tell about the Cultural Revolution and what the Cultural Revolution actually was for ordinary people and what its impact was for Chinese society. Before the Cultural Revolution, corruption and abuse of power became widespread among rural communist leaders soon after the CCP came to power. Of the 625 CCP cadres in Zhejiang, the eastern part of Jimao, 404, more than 64%, were found guilty of corruption charges. In January 1953, Zhi Chanfu, the deputy militia chief of Jindao, began beating up 288 people, forced 107 people to kneel down, and caused 4 suicides in 14 villages. This was confusing for people. After all, how can this kind of outrageous case happen at all? After all, CCP cadres were supposed to be different from old type of officials. They were supposed to be servants of the people. One explanation is a continuity of Chinese political culture. The long history of the gentry rule in China had set the tone of traditional political culture. It was relatively easy to eradicate the political base of the landlord gentry class by dividing their land and wealth among the poor villagers. But it takes time to build up a new political culture in that place of the old one. In a sense, the communists built a new house on the ruins of an old one with revolution, but the air of the old society still permeated this new house. With the culture largely intact, the new communist leaders who replaced the old oppressors of the village slide into certain habits well known to traditional upholders of law and order. The problem of corruption had been recognized by Mao, and through the years of the 50s and 60s, there was various attempts of campaigns launched against these corrupt leaders, but as Han noted, without a radical change of the political culture, which would empower ordinary people, all of Mao's efforts to curb official abuse fell short. For a long time, local bureaucrats were able to abuse their power in the name of the party and communism. Because the tyranny of these party bosses, or Tuhondi, meaning little emperors, as the peasants called them, was done in the name of communism. For if the peasants ever tried to speak out against them, they can say that the very rule of the party and its ideals were being threatened to silence their critics. As these rural villages were so isolated, the Tuhondi were the only party authority the peasants could reach out to, which meant that they could get away with their corruption and abuse of power. During the 60s, after the Great Leap Forward, China was entering into a period of political crisis for the future of communism. In the Soviet Union, with the death of Stalin, the bureaucratic political elite managed to secure power, leading to a somewhat corrupt managerial class that managed the economic and political sphere. What Mao saw in the years after the Great Leap Forward, where there was a decentralization and increase of market exchange in China's economy, which would give rise to a capitalist and bourgeois consciousness, which would destroy the party and inevitably communism in China. Just like how in the Soviet Union there had emerged a bureaucratic class of politicians, this bureaucratic elitist culture was also becoming more and more prevalent inside China amongst political party bosses who we have seen have abused their power in various ways. It was called the Cultural Revolution because this is what was at stake. They needed to preserve proletarian consciousness because the way the economic base was developing made it easier for capitalist rulers and bourgeois consciousness to prevail. The Chinese people needed to bombard the headquarters in order to combat this bourgeois consciousness that was emerging in the Communist Party. The Cultural Revolution was launched in order to empower the peasants against the Tuhundi and stop the emerging bourgeois consciousness that was becoming more and more prevalent for these party bosses. However, when the Cultural Revolution was first launched, rural peasants first heard of it through official work teams sent out by party authorities in the name of leading the Cultural Revolution, were used to suppress the very activity, independent criticism of the party authorities that Mao was trying to encourage by launching the movement. The Tuhundi abused the goals and aims of the Cultural Revolution, where if people were to criticize them, they would be labeled as anti-party in order to silence them. But soon, the peasants were able to make sense of the slogans and quotes of the revolution. They applied the quotes from the Little Red Book to their everyday lives. Peasants no longer had to rely on what the Tuhundi told them communism was, but they could now understand and challenge them themselves. The Tuhundi could no longer blackmail the peasants by labeling them as anti-party over their criticism. They understood that the Cultural Revolution was meant for their own political empowerment. Most of these workers and farmers, unlike the young students who had naive and noble notions about the Cultural Revolution, joined the revolution for very practical reasons. They rebelled because they were not happy with the local Jimu party bosses and with the ways some party leaders conducted official business. They accused the party leaders of turning their units into small independent kingdoms, duly wangua, of distorting central government's policies and enacting their own arbitrary rules, of oppressing people who challenged their authority, and of pilfering public funds. At the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, their challenges were labelled as anti-party and anti-revolution by the local party bosses. Now Mao's 16 points lent them support and they felt empowered. They said, "Chairman Mao supports us and we will not let Chairman Mao down." Something miraculous was happening. The very words that the party bosses used to suppress the peasants became the very tool of their empowerment. Words such as communism, socialism, proletariat, and the people were used before by the Tuhundi to label peasants as traitors, but now the Tuhundi were shown to be wrong on what they were saying. The real meaning reflected something that the peasants already knew intuitively, but they never had the ability to articulate until now. For example, when they talked about the people as a revolutionary subject, just like many dogmatic Marxists today, who only refer to specific workers who reflect their dogmatic idea of what a worker is, leading them to neglect the peasants, just like the Western Marxists do today. However, they now knew that Mao was really talking about them, allowing them to finally stand up to their party bosses. Han notes that while many Westerners see Mao's cult of personality as insane and dystopian, his quotes actually provided the villagers with a strong sense of political power, and they were now finally free from the abuse of local leaders. It's never the urbanized elites who are able to bring about change on the societal level. It's always the ordinary people that represents change in society. It was not these educated students who understood the deeper reality of the Little Red Book. It was the ordinary peasants. This bourgeois radicalism that emerged from the Red Guards was stopped by Mao, and Mao instructed them to go down to the countryside to learn from the peasants, who who had a deep understanding of reality. They didn't see the Cultural Revolution as a way to escape from reality, but rather as an opportunity to make better sense of it. The Cultural Revolution saved communism in China, and this is why it is so significant. Before the Cultural Revolution, there was a sort of defeatist, economist trend that emerged in China that thought that communism is over and that it has failed. The Cultural Revolution successfully removed this form of bourgeois consciousness among party members, separating the sphere of culture and reality. The peasants were able to topple the corrupt party leaders that had bullied them for years, empowering them and giving them political power for the first time. If it wasn't for the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese Communist Party would have likely gone down a similar road to the Soviet Union, degenerating more and more, eventually leading to the restoration of capitalism and the collapse of the country, as what happened in the Soviet Union.